Well, Neil, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to you and to Aliyah and Diana for having me today. So as Neil noted, I'm going to be talking about a book project that I'm working on right now, titled In the Shade of the Sunnah. But today I'll be taking a selection from that project, really a part of chapter 2. Now, for those of you who don't know much about Salafism, there are a few core things to keep in mind. The first is that this is the fastest growing Islamic movement today, full stop. Whether in the Middle East, South Asia, Western Europe, or the United States, wherever you go, you will see Salafis. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what does he mean, you will see Salafis? Well, it's not simply that there will be Salafis in these countries, but that they're highly visible. They are visible because of a set of shared social practices that they claim harken back to 7th century Arabia. And it's really this claim to continuity with this golden moment of Islamic history, not only the Prophet Muhammad, but also the first 3 generations of this community known as a Salaf al-Salih, which is where the name Salafism comes from, that define their claim to authenticity and continuity with the past alike. Now, as I hinted, a central part of what it means to be Salafi is to act Salafi, to look Salafi. And here, visual signifiers play a really important role. They're understood to represent a clear and unambiguous reflection of a Salafi approach, a manhaj Salafi. And here you can see a picture of a few men praying. In the foreground is Mohammed Morsi, the late Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt. And in the background is the man we should be focusing on, Yasser Burhami, who is a leading Egyptian Salafi preacher. Now, there are many things to be said about Mr. Morsi and about Mr. Burhami, but what I really want to point you to are their outfits, and specifically 2 aspects. The first is, let's look at their facial hair. Morsi has a closely trimmed beard. Burhami has a much more sizable beard. Specifically, he trims his mustache and he grows his beard to a minimum of a fist length. Also, you can see not from Morsi, but from his colleague to the right of Burhami, that they have pant legs that go down fully. This seems utterly unremarkable to you, and rightfully so. This is the way most of us wear our pants. But Yasser Burhami's robe goes down a little bit less far. This is because he is observing a prohibition against letting one's robes hang down, known as isbal in Islamic law. And both the beard and the prohibition against letting one's pants or robes hang down are key signature practices of the Salafi movement in the 20th century. So in this presentation, as in the book project of which it is part, I question the Salafi claim to continuity with Islamic history. Instead, I seek to tell a story of the ways in which a Salafi project of practice emerges in the 20th century and functions in particular according to 20th century logics of communication and identity. And today, though, I won't be telling you a story of any particular practice, but instead I'm going to be giving you a sense of how the intellectual architecture that could justify the emergence of a broad Salafi social practice emerged. Because historically, this was a movement that, if it was left to its druthers, it would essentially focus on precise ritual practice and transmitting the right kind of theology. The Salafis have very particular understandings of what quote unquote legitimate or orthodox theology is, which often places most Sunni Muslims, let alone their Shia counterpart, outside the pale. But instead, I'm going to be thinking today with you about how Salafis come to articulate an intellectual architecture that leads by the late 20th century to a claim that they have a particular approach, a manhaj Salafi. Now, to tell the story, I'm going to be focusing on a particular country, Egypt, and on a particular movement, Ansar, al-Sunna, al-Muhammadiyya, proponents of Muhammad's model. And to do so, I draw on widely varying sources, whether theological texts, large, long legal works, these 9 or 10 volume legal works published by Salafi and non-Salafi Muslim scholars alike, and on Islamic periodicals and pamphlets. But in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the last category of sources because fundamentally these sources give us a sense not merely at the ultimate position of the Salafi movement generally and of Ansar al-Sunna in particular on particular issues, but they show us the process by which they reach this point. And so I'll be drawing primarily on two journals published by Egypt's leading Salafi movement, Ansar al-Sunna, one, al-Hadi al-Nabawi, which is published from 1936 to 67, and then the other, at-Tawheed, published from 73 to present. Okay, so before we get into our story, I'm going to lay out a few key terms. The Salaf are the first three generations of the Muslim community. Salafis or Salafism is a 20th century Islamic movement that models itself after this 7th century period. And these three generations of the 7th century. The crucial thing to realize is that while Salafis may lay claim to this period, broadly speaking, this is a period that is considered important for all Muslims, not simply Salafis. A second point here might seem a little bit technical, but it's going to be crucial for understanding what Salafis do in the 20th century. And here we have two core categories of Islamic law. One are acts of worship, or ዒባዳ. These are acts that are essentially non-negotiable. God commands them, you must do them. There's really no negotiation of whether it's legitimate, whether one is required to do them or not. The other category is that of ʿāda, or urf, which means custom. Essentially, the Quran and the authoritative account of the Prophet Muhammad's life, the Sunnah, don't specify much of what Muslims are supposed to do on the day-to-day. And as a result, there's always in Islamic law been a significant place for customary considerations. And indeed, much of the mundane aspect of daily life falls under the domain of custom. Now, a final point about human action and law. Islamic law functions along essentially a 5-part spectrum. On either end of the spectrum are things that are clearly forbidden or required, okay? There's no dispute about these. Often these questions of forbidden and required fall squarely in the domain of worship. But then we have this soft belt middle here, where things can be either disfavored, which is to say, on the day of judgment, one might be judged for them, but they aren't absolutely forbidden. They might be praiseworthy. One's not punished for not doing them, but one may be rewarded on the day of judgment, or simply permitted. Islamic law has absolutely zero view of this matter, that one can do it or not, and it has no effect. Okay, so this brings us to this question of the real world significance of theology in Salafism. And I'll admit with some chagrin that when I was in graduate school, this was before I had started the Salafism project, I said to my advisor, does theology really matter to politics? I look back at that with some amusement now. Now, this story of theology is significant, though, for 3 key reasons. One is it helps us understand Salafism as a project of the 20th century. That as much as the Salafis cite long-standing debates over God's oneness or of the distinction between acts of worship and acts of custom, they don't actually emerge directly from those debates. Instead, their understanding of these questions is deeply shaped by 20th century political concepts, specifically the concept of custom as it is used in projects of secular nationalism. The second point here is that this is the way in which Salafis, responding to competing movements, whether secular nationalists or Islamists, work to politicize daily life. This is how they move beyond the mosque. This is the intellectual architecture without which they would really have no ability to lay claim to broad swaths of society far beyond ritual space. And finally, for those of you who are absolutely uninterested in either Islam or Egypt, this points us to a broader set of questions about the ways in which competing ideological movements offer alternative models of sovereignty that challenge a secular nationalist status quo in the Egyptian case. So for the lecture today, there are going to be 3 main components. One is we're going to establish a historical baseline of the relationship between worship and custom. The second most significant part will be that we'll be looking at the transformation of this distinction between worship and custom from a legal category into a cultural battleground. And that really centers on the period between 1940 and 1970. And finally, I'll be concluding by laying out the articulation of a self-consciously Salafi approach, al-manhaj al-Salafi, in the 1970s and 1980s. So here I begin with a picture of a very important Islamic reformer, not a Salafi, though he was an inspiration to many Salafis, a man named Muhammad Rashid Rida, a native of Syria who made his way to Egypt. Now, Rashid Rida was probably most significant for his efforts to create a transnational Islamic conversation of reform through his journal, Al-Manar, The Lighthouse, which published between 1898 and 1935. But in particular, I want to focus on something that Rashid Rida says in Al-Manar in March of 1904, because it gets us to this question of the intersection of worship and custom, and puts later Salafi claims to the necessity of a particular understanding of Islamic dress into historical context. So Rida declared in March 1904, the Islam of the Arab doesn't reside in his turban. He doesn't become an infidel if he removes the turban during the ritual ablutions, which is to say the washing before prayer. Often peoples that agree about religion differ substantially on dress, as Muslims do between the residents of the Hijaz and Turk and Persian and Egyptian and Tunisian. None wears what the companions of the Prophet wore, and we have no record of the caliphs of Islam commanding the Persians to put on Arab garb. Instead, Muslims distinguished people of the book with particular signs. The clothing of the Prophet was not different than that of the Arab polytheists. So Rida says basically, implicitly, all of these questions of clothing belong squarely to custom. That there's an issue of distinguishing Muslims from non-Muslims, but that among Muslims, there simply is no question of a distinctly Islamic set of clothing that contrasts with non-Islamic clothing. Our second source of a historical baseline is a man named Muhammad Khattab al-Subki, who was the founder of an Islamic movement known as the Jam'iyya Shar'iyya lil-Amilin bil-Kitab wa-Sunnah, the lawful society for those who work according to the Quran and the Sunnah. And he declared in his magnum opus of 8 volumes, The Pure Religion, ad-Din al-Khalis, that was published in the 1920s, Sunnah has become illegitimate innovation, innovation has become Islamic law, ritual or ʿibāda has become conflated with custom, and custom with ritual, okay? We have a clear distinction here. We have worship or ritual, and we have custom. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, so what? I want to hear about the real give and take of political contestation. And we're almost there. But to get there, we need to understand something about Islamic law, or I should say at least one more thing about Islamic law. Now, Islamic law, as I told you, has categories of worship and custom. There's actually a third category. It's of transaction, of mu'amalat. Now, you know that worship is a matter of ritual practice, essentially, and customs are a broad domain of activities that are simply context-specific, that have no particular religious significance. Transactions, or mu'amalat, by contrast, involve mundane aspects of social affairs that are actually pretty important to the broader social order. So issues such as how to handle divorce or inheritance. When it comes to the question of clear boundaries, the worship custom distinction was always pretty well established. There was much more debate over the boundary between worship and transactions. Okay, so that's one point. The second here is that we have a domain of practices called the customs of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, not everything that Muhammad did was considered to be either binding or praiseworthy for Muslims. The things that were considered in these categories were in his capacity as a prophet, as a judge, or as a political leader, okay? So the prophet has particular functions here that don't extend to all of his actions. For example, Muhammad's military strategy is simply not relevant to the question of Islamic law. It's simply put by the wayside. Islamic law essentially doesn't have a position on it. There is, however, a minority opinion, a man of particular significance to the Salafi movement, and that is a jurist from Damascus in Syria named Ibn Taymiyyah, who dies in 1328. And he defines worship, and more broadly, God's oneness, as the term for all that God loves and that pleases him from among the statements and actions hidden and apparent. So Ibn Taymiyyah has an expansive understanding of worship, but he's in the relative minority here, and we're going to be coming back to Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, so now that we've done the nitty-gritty Islamic law portion of this, we can get to our historical story. And here we're thinking about the 1920s and 1930s. In Egypt, as in so many countries across the Middle East and South Asia, we have a transition between a traditional order and questions of both colonial and post-colonial rule. What is the nature of political legitimacy? What is the nature of one's relationship to the past? To what extent are past successful models the key to future success? We also have the rise of mass political parties in this period, whereas before one has a politics of notables, where leading political and economic elites essentially mediate between the population and the ruler. Here we have the rise of mass political parties. Parties that really put a premium on your ability to get people out on the street and to get them out on the street in ways that make clear that they are on your team and not another team. And here I want to come back to this question of politics and visual practice. The 1930s in particular see a shirts movement in Egypt, whether in Germany or in Britain or beyond. We also see this in Egypt. We have the blue shirts allied with the secular nationalist Waft party, and we have the green shirts allied with the fascist Young Egypt party. In both cases, important point here is that these participants are identifiable by how they look. You can see the green shirt and you can see the blue shirt and you know who someone is allied with. And here we need to remember that what one wears isn't simply a static marker, it's performed. One chooses to put it on, one can opportunistically take it off, and it is a way of not only laying claim to public space, but of alerting others that you too are a member of this movement. In the Egyptian case, we also have another cultural shift at play, which is a shift of dress. It's a shift from the long-standing Islamic headgear of the turban, and you can see this turban if you go back to Muhammad Khattab al-Subki or to Rashid Rida. It's also, and instead you see the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood here, Hassan al-Banna, who is wearing the tarbush, which is a red cyclical hat. You also have a shift from robes to pants, right? So in people's daily dress, they are indexing, shifting political, cultural, and religious allegiances. The question then for Salafis is, well, how do you articulate a social vision, right? If one goes back to Rashid Rida, he's very clear. There is no distinctly Islamic garb. So how does one hatch an Islamic garb? And while my broader book project tells a story of the emergence of distinct practices, here we're going to be focusing on this particular question of the intellectual infrastructure of this project. So I mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, our jurist from Damascus, who talked about the unity of worship deriving from his idea of tawhid al-uluhiyya, or relating to monotheism in the Islamic tradition. Now for Ibn Taymiyyah, this was a very, very broad category. This was a category that encompassed everything from how one treated one's parents to giving charity. It was a much broader understanding than many Muslim jurists during this period. But we need to understand the invocation of Ibn Taymiyyah not simply as a throwback to the 13th or 14th century, but as emerging in a very particular cultural and religious moment, a moment in which competing political movements were laying claim to Islamic history. And here I can simply cite Michel Aflaq, one of the premier theorists of secular nationalism in the Arab world, specifically Ba'athist secular nationalism, a Christian actually, who claimed in a 1943 speech that Muhammad was the greatest Arab nationalist leader in history. So we have even Christian nationalists, secular nationalists claiming Muhammad. So it's in this context that a call to the past, and specifically a claim to uphold God's oneness, acquires particular meaning. Okay, so this brings us to our opening debate of the story of worship and custom. And it's between two members or two participants in Ansar al-Sunnah's magazine, al-Hadi al-Namawi. One, Muhammad Bahjat al-Baytar, is a Syrian scholar who essentially was on the moderate end of the Salafi movement during this period, who had a lot in common in many respects with Rashid Rida. And the second is a mosque preacher from the delta town of Rosetta, Abdul Halim Khatit, who took a less flexible approach. But before I draw out the contrast between these two men, I'm going to give you their words about custom and about worship. And we're going to simply notice that they're not actually that different on the surface. So al-Baytar declares in March 1940, Muslims must maintain distinct characteristics based on their particular customs, mushakhasat min al-'ādat al-khāsa bihim, as independence and custom is characteristic of those nations known for independence, okay? Customs are important, it's part of independence, and so forth. The fact that he's talking about nations is striking, and we're going to be getting to that in a second. Khatit, by compliment I might say, declares a few years later, Muslims must have distinct characteristics based on their particular customs because the independence of nations lays in their customs and clothing and increases the depth and rootedness of their independence. Imitation of others leads to the annihilation of the components of the nation. Imitation leads to the loss of many Muslims' interpersonal obligations, such as greeting each other with the greeting of Assalamu alaikum, the salam, and burial in a Muslim cemetery. I'm just going to emphasize here an important point, which is that Khatit draws on the same language as Baytar, mushakhasat min al-'ādat khāsa bihim, and uses the language of the nation, uses the language that would be much more familiar to us in the case of secular nationalism. But from this principle, they go in very different directions. So for al-Baytar, he's not concerned with Muslim garb being entirely distinct from that of non-Muslims. He just needs a visual distinction. It doesn't have to be a wholesale difference. Now, to be clear, al-Baytar is concerned with distinction. He declares the Muslim must be able to identify his co-religionist by his dress, by his clothing, as he knows him by his creed and action. So to be clear, al-Baytar cares a lot about Muslim distinctiveness. But he's also flexible when it comes to the uniqueness of clothing. He declares the Prophet's model didn't necessitate entirely different clothing, that he wore the Byzantine gown and the Persian robe, and therefore, and here he's like Rashid Rida, there's no reason Muslims can't do this kind of thing too. Now, his particular concern, though, is what he terms patriotic garments, which is essentially the wardrobe of the modern bureaucrat and a set of clothing that might go along with that in private space. And here specifically, he talks about the raincoat, the jacket, the pants, or the pajamas, okay? So essentially, this question of clothing that has its origin in a Western context and has been adopted by these colonial and post-colonial states, okay? And to do that, he cites a conversation between the Prophet and a companion, Abu Umama, in which the companion Abu Umama noted that, quote, the people of the book, which is to say the Jews and the Christians, are wearing pants and do not put on a loincloth. In response, the Prophet responds that Abu Umama should wear both pants and the loincloth in order to distinguish himself. So pants are okay, you just can't wear you should also wear a loincloth though to distinguish yourself further. Point being here is just because non-Muslims wear pants doesn't mean that Muslims can't. They just have to be visually distinct. Instead, for al-Baytar, the key concern is really modesty and wholesale imitation. Modesty if the clothing is too tight, so it shows a man's private parts, and imitation in the sense of simply taking on the garb of Western nations, or specifically here the language conceptually is non-Muslims, and simply imitating them in that context. Khatit, however, takes a very different view, and a view that actually ultimately gets a lot more support within the Salafi movement. He claims the claim of clothing is not a national one. It's not a mas'ala kawniyya, it is a religious one. It is a mas'ala diniyya, Islamiyya. So for him, the Prophet Muhammad commands that Muslims distinguish themselves from non-Muslims, and this means that visual distinction is not enough. You need to have wholesale difference. Now, I show you this debate not simply to show that the Salafi intellectual project is one that is very much a dynamic one in formation during this period, but also to make the point that the basic logical starting point of both is a focus on custom, but it's not custom of the Islamic tradition. And I was really wondering where this was coming from. And then I saw a particularly wonderful elucidation of it just a few years later in a Syrian Salafi periodical, At-Tamadun al-Islami, or Islamic Civilization. And this was written by a main figure within the Syrian Islamic scene, Muhammad bin Kamal al-Khatib. And it was titled Custom and Society, al-ʿāda wal-Mujtama. Customs begin with the simplest and extent of the highest manifestations of life. Islam made its norms of comportment and sunnah into widespread customs, such as the beard and the greeting among Muslims. And one of the bases of its customs, prayer, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. All this underscores the extent of Islam's concern for and interest in customs. You might be thinking to yourself, this has nothing to do with what we've just heard about the distinction between worship and custom, and you're right. Prayer has become a custom. This is really an idea of custom that emerges from secular nationalist currents during this period. It makes no sense in terms of Islamic law. It simply superimposes one idea of custom on top of another. So this is, in short, the big rupture for Salafism. It's a rupture of the shift from a long-standing distinction between worship and custom to the adoption of a secular nationalist understanding of custom. A shift that, if you asked Salafis, they would deny up and down, because the Salafi position is that there is continuity, not rupture. Now, the reason why this story matters is because in the late 1960s, early 70s, Salafis start to claim a Salafi method, a manhaj Salafi. Now, the term manhaj has a similarly striking genealogy because it emerges not from Islamic law or even a longer Islamic scholarly tradition, but rather from debates about educational curriculum in the 20th century. So the manhaj is usually understood in the term of an educational manhaj, not a religious manhaj. But in that context, in the context of the expansion of mass education in Egypt and elsewhere, the term manhaj has a certain cultural purchase. And it's here that Salafis start to claim a distinct manhaj. But their problem is that they're not alone. So here I'm quoting a leading Kuwaiti Salafi who in 1975 declares the Salafi manhaj is direct engagement with the Quran and the Sunnah. There's this ambiguity as to what direct engagement means, but this is the claim, and you now know the origins of this history. But there are competing voices. We have the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt declaring that they follow manhaj al-amal al-Islami, the method of Islamic action. And you have a member of a leading state religious body, the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs, who declares, we are preachers in the path of God following the method of Islam, manhaj al-Islam. So everyone is claiming manhaj. So I've told you the story of worship and custom. Hopefully I haven't bored you too much in the weeds when it comes to these legal distinctions, but they matter because they tell us not merely how Salafis draw on the past, but also how they depart from this past in unspoken yet highly significant ways. This is a story of theology. It's a story of the broadening of the domain of worship to encompass many social practices that were previously the domain of custom. That matters not simply because we understand how Salafis lay claim to society, but also to understand why this claim to society is such an important one for them religiously, that they understand it as being a core part of upholding God's oneness. Just as importantly, they didn't understand this as such 50 years earlier. Second point is about textual interpretation. Too often, both scholars and journalists take at face value the Salafi claim to literalism and textual interpretation. But literalism too is an interpretive project. And here I've showed you an example of the ways in which an ostensibly straightforward transfer of a long-standing Islamic debate into the modern period masks really radical ruptures. And finally, this question of social practice. To come back to our good friend Yasser Burhami, a way of understanding where this Salafi project of distinct social practices comes from. While each practice has its own path, it has its ups and downs, it has its migration, the big picture is that none of this would be possible without the development of a broader Salafi manhaj, and the Salafi manhaj is not possible without this effacement of the long-standing distinction between worship and custom. So on that note, I will let us get into the Q&A, but thanks all for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, let me just get my video on 1 second. All right, thank you, Aaron, for that excellent presentation. So the floor is open now for questions and comments and discussion. As Aliyah mentioned in the beginning, there are 2 ways you can ask questions. One is to type them out in the Q&A if that's your choice. Otherwise, you can raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you can ask Aaron your question directly. So the floor is open.
Hi.
Go ahead, Jackie.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I was really curious about the section when you were talking about visual distinction and its connection to clothing and nationalism. And there's been a lot of work that connect national identity, religion, and clothing, but they often focus on women. And I'm curious to know, in your research, in the particular context that you're working in, is clothing also connected to issues of religion and manhood and masculinity? I mean, how does that all sort of unravel and play out? Thank you.
Jackie, thank you for this question. So one of the things I realized as I got to the end of this project that I didn't realize at the beginning is that this question of gender is really at the center of Salafi social practice. That in some respects, we think of Salafism as the Salafi movement as one that seeks to make women invisible, that seeks to enforce gender segregation, that seeks to the extent that it can promote women in the home. And this is all true. And that has its own logic of visual communication, of women being essentially undistinguishable. Whether it actually functions like that in practice is an entirely different question. In the case of men, though, there's a similarly important project of masculinity that also centers on these visual cues, that men have both the opportunity and the burden of publicly performing their piety, but to do so, they need to essentially work according to particular defined signs. And one can't be a Salafi man without adhering to at least some of these signs. So to give you an example, this comes from the message board of a leading Salafi website, ahlulhadith.com. And I think the letter was from 2006, so it was outside the scope of the sources I use for this project. But it was essentially of this convert to Islam who wanted to be Salafi, and he had a problem. He couldn't grow a beard. He said, my facial hair is patchy and emaciated. I'll never quite forget the language he uses. And basically, I have two problems. I want to resemble the messenger of God, Muhammad, and B, no one identifies me as a Salafi because I don't have a real beard, or a real beard for Salafis anyway. And so in this context, there's this real challenge of how do you perform your masculinity if you can't if you can't perform the relevant signs. And while some of the signs of Salafism in terms of masculinity are not based on whether or not you can do something physically, the shortening the robe, for example, really doesn't depend on that. Another key practice, which is praying in shoes, doesn't depend on that. The beard does. And so you'll have these challenges of masculinity that these young men face, not only if they have a challenge of growing a beard, but also if, say, they live in a country where they are conscripted into the army. This is something that comes up in Egypt all the time. And they're required to shave their beard. And essentially, they're going into this hyper macho masculinity of the military, and they don't know what to do. And so they end up writing to Salafi scholars and saying, help me. And the answer for some is get the heck out of Egypt, go to Saudi Arabia. The answer of others is basically you just shave your beard and you can grow it back later because you can't uproot your life. So there's a widely varying range of options for them, but the core problem of not merely piety, but masculinity really remains.
Thank you.
Aaron, we have a question in the Q&A from Peter Coppins. I'm not positive everyone else can see this, so I'll just read it just in case. It says, since you mentioned Beitar and ʿīdā on these issues, I was wondering what your take is on the current debate on continuity between earlier reformist Salafism and later Puritan Salafism.
So Peter, thank you for this question. So for broadly speaking, to characterize this debate for those who don't spend their days reading books about Salafism, we are an admittedly small sect of folks. This is really a question of how to understand the relationship between the Islamic reformers, leading Islamic reformers of the early 20th century, who had a more open view of cultural accommodation, and a purist Salafi movement that takes a much more black and white view of what is allowed and what is not. These are the folks who follow the Khatit line to a much greater degree. Now, in terms of this question of the continuity between ṟīdā and Beitar and what follows, I think there's much more rupture than continuity. They cite ṟīdā, but they cite him very opportunistically. To a much lesser degree, you find Salafis in the 70s and 80s citing Bahjat al-Beitar. He's kind of useless at this point for their purposes. Ultimately, though, the question that they're all facing together, and this is what in some sense brings together these folks, some of whom are now categorized as Islamic modernists and others as purist Salafis, is how do you maintain cultural distinction and religious distinction? And the challenge for all of them is that historically this was a question of distinguishing Muslims from non-Muslims. What happens in the 20th century in the context of post-colonial rule in particular, so thinking largely after 1950, is that the challenge is no longer primarily distinguishing Muslims from non-Muslims. It is fundamentally distinguishing Muslims from other Muslims. And there you need to be much more exacting about religious practice because you're actually making a much more minor distinction. And so here I see, and when I read the Salafis of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it doesn't seem like Beitar or ṟīdā would have much of a place. So I tend to view this as a pretty significant rupture.
Ibrahim, do you have a question?
Oh yes. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for the talk. It's amazing. I really like the project. So I have two questions. The first question is about the kind of connections or relations between the Salafis during that time with other Islamist movements or institutions. So, for example, when we talk about the clothing or the attire of the Muslim during that time and how the Salafis look at it. But at the same time, for example, if we look at the Azharis, the other institution, we kind of see even the grand imams themselves kind of not practicing, you know, the short jalabiyya or uftan. So it's kind of different in terms of the clothing and as well the beard itself. We find many Azhari sheikhs shaved with no beards, and if they have beards, it would be one similar to that of the Muslim Brotherhood. So like, I was wondering if there was this kind of debate going on between the Salafis and the Azharis at that time. And the other question, when you mentioned about Salafis going to the army and then they having to shave their beards, we see after the coup in 2013 where many of the Salafis actually shaved their beards out of fear that they might be mistaken for the Muslim Brotherhood. So I was wondering, maybe you did not come across that, but maybe also in the 50s and 60s when Nasser cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood, if a similar debate showed up in terms of the beard and, you know, being permissible or allowed to shave that beard in such circumstances where the Islamists are being cracked upon. Thank you.
Ibrahim, thank you for these questions. So it's really, Salafism has kind of a complicated relationship with Al-Azhar in Egypt, in part because many Salafis are graduates of this leading Sunni Islamic seminary. But they have a very different textual approach, and they also are trying to start a movement. Al-Azhar is fundamentally an institution, has a set of institutional interests of how do scholars serve as guardians of an Islamic tradition and essentially take the position that they're not engaged in any kind of mass political project. So they end up attacking the Azharis a lot. I do think that that notwithstanding the similarities, the big distinction between the Salafi movement, specifically Ansar Sunnah, and al-Azhar, is that one of them is that the Salafis are really invested in a new order, right? An order in which long-standing models of clothing are set aside. Now, you might be thinking, oh, wait, aren't the Salafis very traditionalist? They are, but they're traditionalists of a particular type. They aren't interested in the Islamic tradition as it has developed over 13 or 1400 years. They're interested in essentially cutting off all but about 100 years of that tradition and focusing on the 7th century. And so that's really, I think, the gist of their argument with the Azharis, that they're trying to reinstate a set of social practices that have fallen by the wayside, you know, in some cases, hundreds of years before. So this is true in the case of Salafis promoting praying in shoes. It's true in the case of Salafis promoting the prohibition against letting one's robe hang down, of Isbal. Now, in terms of your second question, of whether the Salafis are concerned about visual distinction from the Brotherhood in the 50s and 60s, I've seen no evidence of that. What one does see, though, in the 70s and 80s is that they're extremely concerned with being confused with activists of the Islamic student movement, the Jama'ah Islamiyya, who a segment of which takes a violent turn in the 80s. And so their issue there is these guys in the Jama'ah Islamiyya have these big beards, they wear these long white robes, and they are, the Salafis who have no connection to this keep getting rounded up by state security. And they're saying not every man who wears a big beard and a jalabiyya is a jihadi, come on. And this is something that Salafis in Egypt comment about. This is something that Salafis in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait who are observing their counterparts in Egypt note, that this is a real problem for the Egyptian Salafi movement, the majority of which really steers clear not just of political violence, but of politics, period. They are largely quietist in a sense, but yeah, the possibility of confusion of visual signs is something that continually bedevils Ansar Sunnah.
Aaron, we have a related question in the Q&A from Naderman Amin, and Naderman is asking whether you find these sartorial and corporeal practices between the 7th and 19th century? And was the Salafi trend a resurgence for a functional purpose? Relatedly, is there any reason the beard and shortened clothes in particular are so essential to Egyptian Salafism? Why not henna of the hands as we see in South Asia, for example?
Okay, Nariman, thank you for these questions. So I think the point that I'd like to make about the Salafi reconstruction of the 7th century is not that on a purely technical level, many of the things that they seek to do aren't reasonable approximations of what was done in the 7th century. My argument is that this is about a changed logic of practice. It's a really important focus on visibility, and not just visibility between Muslims and non-Muslims, but visibility among Muslims. It's also an assumption that what one does in terms of these acts of visual distinction are not merely superficialities, but rather bear directly on your ethical project of moral rectitude. Now, there's this question then of how do we understand this? And to get to your question about functionality, I've long been tempted and had to push myself back against a purely functionalist view of these social practices, because it works like a nice equation, right? There's a social context, you have a practice that serves a functional need, and bam, you have your primary explanation. And I do think that Salafis are social creatures like anyone else, and they consciously or unconsciously are responding to both those opportunities and constraints. I do think, though, there's more going on. And the thing that I think is going on beyond that is that Salafis care deeply about their textual methodology. However realistically they can claim to be engaging in unmediated preservation of an early Islamic model, they care deeply about these textual debates. And so a second way of understanding these debates over proper dress is that this is essentially the space where these internal questions of religious authority, specifically of how textual interpretation should work, get played out. And I'll give you an example of that. So there's this question of whether, I mentioned that the beard has to be a minimum of a fist, the ḥāda. But there's a question of whether it can be trimmed if it goes beyond a fist. And there was this wonderful debate between two leading Salafis, the leading Saudi Arabian Salafi, Abdulaziz bin Baz, and the leading Albanian turned Syrian towards Jordanian Salafi, Muhammad Nasr ad-Din al-Albani. And bin Baz said, there's a command, afu alaha, grow the beard, and that's it. You can't cut it, because the Prophet said to grow it, so you can't cut it. And in response, al-Albani said, yeah, but we have examples of companions of the Prophet cutting it. And that these examples suggest that if companions of the Prophet were cutting it, then therefore the model set for the command of the Prophet to grow the beard is not an absolute one, that it is modified by the practice of companions. This is essentially a debate that happens among Salafis. There's not necessarily any clear functional payoff for it, but it does speak to this broader question of what's more important. Is it what Muhammad does, or is what his companions do? What's the balance between the two that I don't think can be reduced to this functional question? Final point I'll make about your questions is that these practices are highly context specific. So they have meaning in an Egyptian context that they might not in a Saudi context, for example. So I'll give you the example of praying in shoes. This is something that essentially falls off after the early centuries of Islam. In the early centuries of Islam, it was, the logic was that this distinguished Muslims from Jews, because Jews in Arabia during the Prophet's time apparently prayed without shoes, barefoot. But at a certain point, this is simply not true anymore. It's also true that when one wears shoes to pray, even if one does various methods of ritual purity, there's still more dust and dirt that gets in the mosque. And so this practice basically totally falls off. And in Egypt, it falls off completely. And it's brought back in the 1940s by Ansar Sunnah. But in Saudi Arabia, it's never quite dropped off. And as a result, the practice of praying in shoes is much less powerful for Salafis in Saudi Arabia than it is for Salafis in Egypt, simply because it doesn't offer the same visual distinction.
I see Sami Lemon.
Yeah, hi. I want to ask you if you trace the origins of the qamis, you know, the amama, and the whole like this kind of cartoonish look that Salafis, you know, put on in different places. So, for instance, I mean, in certain cases, it becomes like a national outfit, like in Pakistan, like in Indonesia. So my question is like, trace the origin of this thick dress code, because everybody has
Sami, I think you're cutting in and out, unfortunately. Would you mind maybe typing your question in the Q&A? In the meantime, Aaron, we'll wait for Sami's question, but we have a question from Holden Ringel in the Q&A. Given the theological rigor of the Salafi movement, how do children fit into it? As for the issues of presentation that you discussed, would they be expected to follow the same customs of visual distinction as adult Salafi, since they wouldn't be able, in the case of boys, to grow beards?
Great, Holden, great question. So these obligations are really on men. They're not on boys. And so basically this question of children is almost entirely absent from Salafi debates over proper practice. It's simply not part of the story. I think the core concern of Salafi elites vis-a-vis the youth, particularly boys, is one of education. And here they are very concerned about a broader religious sphere in Egyptian society, in particular, in which one might learn non-Salafi practices. And here it's important to remember that Salafi or non-Salafi, most Egyptian kids go to public school. And the state teaches religion in public school. And it teaches particular understandings of Islamic law in public school. And so as a result, their core concern isn't so much whether these young boys will practice Islam correctly, but rather A, that there are alternative forms of religious instruction, and B, that they go to the mosque with their fathers so that they can imitate their practice. But there really is absolutely no conversation about children beyond that. If there was, I think it would have probably been the basis for an article, because it would be a great topic.
Aaron, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as a moderator to ask you a question. Just a few minutes ago, in response to someone's question, you mentioned that the point of Salafism was to distinguish Muslims from other Muslims rather than an earlier practice of distinguishing Muslims from non-Muslims. This is sort of deeply embedded in the particular histories of Egypt or other countries in the Arab world where you have Muslim majorities, right? When I think back to when I started doing my dissertation research in Uganda, for instance, in 2000, 2001, and I started to see Muslims in Uganda dressed in ways that you describe. I didn't know what was going on at the time. Now I know more, mostly because of you. And there's, Muslims in Uganda, for instance, are a minority. It's just, a significant minority, but maybe 20% of the population, let's say. And there's not as much of a need to distinguish yourself politically in that context as there would be in a place like Egypt. So I'm wondering, what do you think that would mean what would that index in this sort of context? And someone starts taking up, growing their beard and wearing their pants short in a context where you have a Muslim minority in a country, and where it's clear that, there will never be sort of Muslims ruling the country, most likely. So what would they be trying to index in that case? And this sort of hints to the question of like transnational Salafism that isn't connected as intimately to a national political project as it might be in a place like Egypt.
So great question. The background to my answer is that the traditional explanation, Neil, to your question, the traditional answer is it's all about Saudi Arabia. That this is about a global Saudi project of proselytization that sweeps away local Islam and installs in its place an uncompromising religious vision. Now, I find this narrative problematic for two reasons. One is because it doesn't distinguish between the fact that on the one hand, there are Salafi scholars in Saudi Arabia, but the bulk of the scholarly hierarchy are actually not Salafis, they're Wahhabi Hanbalis, which is to say they're distinguished by a commitment to the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and to the Hanbali school of law. The second is that it doesn't really take seriously how local projects, wherever they come from, acquire a particular coloring in their setting. And so I'll give you the example of the beard, actually. So there's been some fantastic scholarship on Islam in Africa and its relationship to areas ranging from the Arab world to South Asia. And so I was workshopping the beard chapter of this book with a colleague of mine who works on Salafism in Nigeria. And he said to me, he said, the most prominent Salafi in Nigeria doesn't wear a beard. You know, he wouldn't be recognized as a Salafi in Egypt. And I just looked at it and I said, wow, that's amazing. Because the Egyptian Salafis are absolutely sure that this is required. And this guy, whose last name is Adam, I'm blanking on his first name now, he doesn't take the view that this is required. He didn't take the view before his death that this was required. And so what's striking here is that I can tell a story about Egypt, but that ultimately the Salafi project as it is lived in countries, whether other countries, whether in the Middle East, in South Asia and Africa, it does maintain certain connections, continuities. There is this transnational network of Salafi thought, of Salafi institutions. People flock to some of the same institutions, whether in Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Egypt. But ultimately, what those projects look like on the ground locally differ really significantly. And I'm in this project, essentially, among other things, pushing back against this assumption that there is a single transnational Salafi project that exerts its power to shape not only how people pray or think theologically, but also how they live their daily lives. Because the social signs are simply too context dependent, at least if they're going to be effective.
Thank you. So Aaron, our custom is to end at 1 o'clock so that people can, in normal times, run off to class, in this case, log on to class. And we're a few minutes over 1, so I think I'm going to stop it here, but thank you so much.